Welcome, kind listener, to this peaceful haven of history. This is a place where stories flow like a gentle river, carrying us far away from the rush of the present. Whether you are lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, or sitting quietly as the evening settles, know that you are among friends here. If you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from. I treasure the chance to see how history brings together people from every corner of the world. And if these calm journeys speak to you, go ahead and subscribe, so our paths may cross again in the chapters to come. But for now, let the noise of today drift away, and join me as we wander softly into the mists of the past. There exists in the collective memory of humanity a figure so vast, so terrible, and yet so strangely magnetic that his name alone conjures images of endless steppes, thundering hooves, and cities turned to dust beneath the weight of conquest. Genghis Khan. Even now, nearly 8 centuries after his death, the very sound of those syllables carries with it the weight of legend, the echo of empires rising and falling like the breath of the earth itself. And with that legend comes a claim so staggering that it challenges the imagination, a statistic repeated in documentaries, articles, and conversations across the modern world, that Genghis Khan and his Mongol armies killed 72% of humanity. 72%. Nearly 3/4 of every living soul on Earth, extinguished in the span of a few decades by the fury of mounted warriors sweeping across the known world. It is a number that arrests us, that makes us pause and wonder at the scale of devastation such a figure implies. And yet, as with so many claims that echo through the corridors of popular history, we must ask ourselves, quietly and carefully, whether this legend holds the weight of truth, or whether it is something else entirely, a myth born from the marriage of genuine terror and the human tendency to magnify what we cannot fully comprehend. Tonight, as the world outside your window grows still and the day releases its hold on your thoughts, let us walk together through this question, gently untangling the threads of fact from fiction, exploring not just what happened in those distant centuries, but how we have come to remember it, and what that memory reveals about us. To begin, we must travel back, not just in years but in imagination, to a world so different from our own that it might as well exist in a dream. The year is somewhere near 1162, though the exact date remains lost to the wind and dust of the Mongolian plateau. In this place, where the sky stretches endlessly above rolling grasslands and the only sounds are the whisper of wind through grass and the distant call of eagles, a child is born. His name, given at birth, is Temujin, and he arrives into a world of hardship, of tribal warfare, of constant movement and survival on the edge of existence. His father, Yasugei, is a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man of some standing but hardly a king, hardly the father of the men who would one day be called the Khan of Khans. The Mongolia of Temujin's youth is a fractured place, a mosaic of competing tribes and clans locked in endless cycles of alliance and betrayal, raid and counter-raid. The Mongols themselves are not yet a unified people, but rather a collection of groups, the Borjigin, the Tayikiad, the Merkits, and others, each jealously guarding their pastures, their horses, their honor. Life here is measured in seasons and survival, in the ability to endure winters so brutal they can freeze a man in his saddle, and summers so brief that every moment of warmth must be seized and used. There are no cities here, no monuments of stone, only the felt-covered jairs, the circular tents that can be packed and moved as the herds move, following the grass and water that sustain both animal and human life. When Temujin is still a boy, perhaps 9 years old, his father is poisoned by Tatar tribesmen, old enemies nursing grievances that stretch back generations. With Yasugei's death, the family's position collapses. The clan abandons them, leaving Temujin, his mother Holon, and his siblings to fend for themselves on the unforgiving steppe. It is a sentence of slow death, a casting out into a world where survival without the protection of a tribe is nearly impossible. And yet they survive. Holon, a woman of extraordinary strength and determination, holds her children together through sheer force of will, teaching them to dig for roots, to fish in the cold rivers, to trap marmots and birds, to endure the shame of poverty and abandonment. These early years of deprivation carve something into Temujin's character, a hardness, a relentless drive, but also a peculiar kind of vision. He learns that the old tribal loyalties are fragile, that kinship by blood can dissolve in an instant when convenience dictates, but that loyalty earned through merit, through shared hardship, through the bonds of choice rather than birth, can be unbreakable. He learns to see beyond the immediate horizon of clan rivalry, to imagine something larger, something that does not yet exist but might, if a man were bold enough and ruthless enough and clever enough to seize it. His early manhood is a story of slow accumulation, of gathering followers one by one, often men like himself, outcasts and younger sons with nothing to lose and everything to gain. He makes alliances, breaking some and keeping others. He rescues his wife Borte when she is kidnapped by merchants, an act that demonstrates both his loyalty and his willingness to fight for what is his. Slowly, painfully, he builds a reputation, not as a man of noble birth, which he is not in any meaningful sense, but as a man of ability, of cunning, of unstoppable will. By the time he reaches his 40s, Temujin has done what no one before him has accomplished. Through a combination of military brilliance, political acumen, and sheer ruthlessness, he has unified the Mongol tribes under a single banner. In 1206, at a great gathering called a Kurultai, he is proclaimed Genghis Khan, a title whose meaning scholars still debate, perhaps meaning oceanic or universal ruler, a name that speaks to dominion without limit, to authority as vast as the sea or sky. He is not merely a tribal leader now, but something new, the founder of a nation, the architect of a state organized not by blood ties but by military efficiency and meritocracy. And it is here that our story truly begins, because what Genghis Khan creates is not simply another nomadic confederation doomed to fragment at his death. What he creates is a war machine of unprecedented effectiveness, a force that will, in the span of just a few decades, explode outward from the steppes of Mongolia to conquer the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. An empire that at its height will stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, an empire that will reshape trade routes, destroy civilizations, and alter the genetic and cultural landscape of Eurasia in ways that persist to this day. But to understand how this happened, we must first understand the Mongol way of war, because it is in the details of their military system that we find the seeds of both their extraordinary success and the terrible reputation that follows them through history. The Mongol army is built around the horse, that fundamental animal that has shaped the steppe peoples for millennia. Every Mongol warrior is a horseman from childhood, learning to ride almost before he can walk, spending his days in the saddle, moving with the herds, hunting, practicing with bow and lance until these tools become extensions of his body. A Mongol warrior can shoot accurately from horseback at a full gallop, can turn in the saddle to fire backward as he retreats, a tactic called the Parthian shot that has confounded armies since ancient times. But the Mongols under Genghis Khan are not simply skilled riders. They are organized with a level of discipline and structure that would be the envy of any sedentary state. The army is divided into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each level with clear chains of command, each warrior knowing his place and his role. They practice coordinated maneuvers, feigned retreats that draw enemy forces into ambushes, encirclements that leave no avenue of escape, movements across vast distances with a speed that seems impossible to their adversaries. They are masters of intelligence gathering, sending scouts far ahead, interrogating merchants and travelers, building detailed pictures of enemy strength and geography before a single arrow is fired. And when battle comes, the Mongols bring to bear a terrifying combination of mobility, firepower, and psychological warfare. Their composite bows, made of horn and sinew and wood, laminated together, can shoot arrows farther and with more force than the simpler bows of their enemies. A Mongol horse archer can carry multiple quivers, can fire dozens of arrows in the time it takes a European knight to close the distance for a single lance charge. And if heavy cavalry is needed, the Mongols have that too, warriors in lamellar armor riding armored horses, capable of smashing through infantry lines like a thunderbolt. But perhaps most devastating of all is the Mongol willingness to use terror as a tool of statecraft. Genghis Khan understands, with a clarity that is almost modern in its cynicism, that reputation can be as powerful as the sword. Cities that resist are utterly destroyed, their populations massacred, their buildings razed, their fields sown with salt, the survivors sent fleeing to spread tales of horror that will reach the next city, the next kingdom, softening resistance before the Mongols even arrive. It is a brutal calculus, one that trades immediate horror for long-term efficiency, that seeks to break the will to resist before battle is even joined. This strategy, as cold-blooded as it is effective, is one of the primary sources of the dark legend that grows around the Mongols. Because there is no question that their conquests are accompanied by immense bloodshed, by scenes of devastation that haunt the chronicles of the age. When the Mongols take the great cities of Central Asia, places like Bokhara and Samarkand and Merv, the death tolls are staggering. Medieval sources speak of pyramids built of human skulls, of rivers running red, of populations driven into the countryside to be hunted down like animals. The Persian historian Adamalik Javani, writing in the generation after the conquest, describes the fall of Merv in terms that still make the blood run cold, claiming that each Mongol warrior was assigned a quota of people to execute, hundreds per soldier, numbers that if taken at face value suggest a massacre on a scale almost beyond comprehension. And yet, here we must pause, taking a breath, letting the weight of these claims settle while we ask ourselves what we are really reading. Medieval chronicles, particularly those describing enemies or conquests, are not police reports or census data. They are narratives, shaped by the purposes and perspectives of their authors, influenced by literary conventions that value the dramatic and the moralistic over the strictly factual. Numbers in medieval texts are often symbolic, meant to convey the magnitude of an event rather than its precise dimensions. A chronicler writing that a city's population was entirely destroyed might mean that the military and political elite were eliminated, that the city's power was broken, not necessarily that every living soul was put to the sword. This is not to say that the Mongol conquests were not devastating. They absolutely were. Archaeological evidence confirms that many cities suffered severe destruction, that population levels in some regions dropped dramatically, that entire irrigation systems in places like Persia and Central Asia were destroyed and took centuries to recover. The Mongols were not exaggerating when they used terror as a weapon, and the suffering they inflicted was real and immense. But there is a crucial difference between acknowledging that the Mongol conquests caused tremendous death and destruction, and accepting the claim that they killed 72% of humanity. So where does this specific number come from? When we trace it backward through popular history, through YouTube videos and blog posts and casual references, we find that it doesn't lead to any serious historical study, to any demographic analysis or scholarly consensus. Instead, it appears to be a modern invention, a misunderstanding or exaggeration that has taken on a life of its own in the age of the internet, where striking claims spread faster than careful corrections. The number seems to conflate several different things: the percentage of people killed in specific regions during Mongol invasions, the global genetic legacy attributed to Genghis Khan and his descendants, which we'll discuss in a moment, and a general sense that the Mongol conquests were so vast and so terrible that they must have affected the majority of humanity. But when we look at the actual demographics of the 13th century, the claim falls apart rather quickly. Historians estimate that the world population around 1200 was somewhere between 360 and 450 million people. The majority of these people lived in regions that the Mongols never conquered or even seriously threatened. China, which the Mongols did eventually conquer, had a population of perhaps 100 million or more, and while the conquest was brutal and deadly, particularly in northern China where Jin dynasty territory was fought over for decades, the population was not reduced by anything close to 72%. The Song dynasty in southern China, which held out until the 1270s, saw population disruption and loss from warfare and disease, but again, not extermination. The Islamic world, which suffered tremendously under Mongol assault, particularly in Persia and Mesopotamia, had a population of perhaps 60 to 80 million across its entire extent. The Mongol invasions of the 1220s through the 1250s caused massive casualties and disruption in the Eastern Islamic world, but the Mamluks in Egypt stopped the Mongol advance in 1260 at the Battle of Ain Jalut, and the Maghreb in North Africa was never touched by Mongol armies at all. Europe, with a population of perhaps 60 to 80 million, experienced a Mongol raid into Poland and Hungary in 1241 that was terrifying but brief, withdrawn after the death of Genghis Khan. The Mongols never attempted a full-scale conquest of Europe, and the vast majority of Europeans never saw a Mongol warrior in their lives. India, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas, Oceania, these regions, containing hundreds of millions of people, were completely untouched by the Mongol conquests. The Mongols were fearsome and effective, but they were not omnipresent, not omnipotent, and their reach, vast as it was, had limits. To claim that they killed 72% of humanity requires either that they killed nearly everyone in the regions they did conquer, which demographic evidence does not support, or that their impact somehow reached far beyond their actual military campaigns, perhaps through disease or ecological disruption. And here we encounter another piece of the puzzle, one that is historically important but often confused with direct killing. The 13th and 14th centuries are a time of significant climate stress and disease. The medieval warm period is giving way to cooler, more unstable conditions. Famines become more common. And most significantly, in the mid-14th century, the Black Death sweeps across Eurasia, killing perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the population in the regions it touches. Some historians have speculated that the Mongol Empire, by creating unprecedented connections between East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, by making the Silk Road safer and more traversed than ever before, inadvertently facilitated the spread of the plague bacteria that caused the Black Death. This is a fascinating and important historical question, one that speaks to the complex and often unintended consequences of human actions. The Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, does indeed create conditions for greater trade and communication across Eurasia. Merchants travel more freely, goods and ideas and yes, potentially diseases, move along routes that were previously more fragmented and dangerous. But even if we accept that the Mongol Empire played a role in the conditions that allowed the Black Death to spread so devastatingly, and this remains debated among scholars, we cannot reasonably attribute plague deaths to the deliberate military actions of Genghis Khan. That would be like blaming the Roman Empire for every disease that traveled along Roman roads. The causal chain is too attenuated, too dependent on factors outside any one person or state's control or intent. So if the 72% figure is not supported by historical or demographic evidence, why has it gained such traction? Part of the answer lies in the very real and devastating impact the Mongols had on specific regions. In Persia, for example, the Mongol invasions of the 1220s and 1250s were catastrophic. The sophisticated irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for millennia were destroyed. Cities were depopulated. Scholars have estimated that Iran's population may have dropped by as much as half or even more over the course of the Mongol period and its aftermath, though disentangling deaths from conquest, from disease, from economic collapse, and from migration is extremely difficult. These are losses on a scale that genuinely alters the trajectory of a civilization, and the memory of them burns deeply into cultural consciousness. Similarly, in Central Asia, in the great cities that had flourished along the Silk Road, the Mongol conquests mark a turning point. Places like Samarkand and Bokhara recover, but others, like Merv, never regain their former prominence. The ecological damage to irrigation systems, combined with the shift in trade routes and political centers, means that some regions experience long-term population decline that lasts centuries. When we read the chronicles of these places, written by survivors and their descendants, we are reading the testimony of people who have witnessed the end of a world, and their accounts carry that weight of loss and horror. In northern China, the conquest of the Jin dynasty is similarly brutal. The Mongols, initially more interested in plunder than administration, allow cities to be sacked repeatedly, kill or enslave massive numbers of people, and turn farmland into pasture for their herds. It takes decades, and the influence of advisors like Yilu Chucai who convince the Mongol leadership that living peasants are more valuable than dead ones, before a more sustainable system of rule emerges. The population disruption is severe, though again, not total annihilation. These regional catastrophes, genuine as they are, get telescoped in popular memory into a global apocalypse. The Mongols become in the Western imagination, particularly, the embodiment of destruction, the horsemen of the apocalypse made flesh, the ultimate barbarian horde. This image is reinforced by the fact that many European sources learned of the Mongols through refugees and reports from Eastern Europe and the Middle East, hearing stories that were already filtered through trauma and fear. The name Mongol itself becomes conflated with Tartar, a deliberate connection by medieval Christians to Tartarus, the classical underworld, as if these warriors were literally demons from hell. And there is another element to consider in how the Mongol legend has been shaped, and that is the question of genetic legacy. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a study that made headlines around the world. They had discovered a Y chromosome lineage that appeared in approximately 8% of men across a vast swath of Asia, from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. 16 million men, all sharing a common male ancestor who lived approximately 1,000 years ago. The researchers noted that the distribution and timing were consistent with this lineage originating from Genghis Khan and his male line descendants, who ruled across this territory and had access to vast numbers of women through both marriage alliances and the prerogatives of conquest. This finding is extraordinary from a genetic perspective, a testament to the way that power and reproduction have been linked throughout human history, the way that successful men in patriarchal societies have often had disproportionate numbers of offspring. But in popular retellings, this genetic legacy sometimes gets confused with the death toll question. The fact that Genghis Khan may have 16 million living male line descendants gets mixed up with claims about how many people died, as if the two statistics were somehow related or equivalent. They are not. One speaks to reproduction and dynastic success over centuries, the other to immediate casualties of war. Conflating them is a category error, but it happens frequently in casual discussions of the Mongol legacy. As we breathe slowly here in the quiet of this night, considering these tangled threads of history and myth, it's worth stepping back and asking what we can say with confidence about the human cost of the Mongol conquests. Historians who work with demographic data, with archaeological evidence, with careful reading of chronicles from multiple perspectives, generally estimate that the Mongol conquests caused somewhere between 30 and 40 million deaths across the 13th century. This is an enormous number, one of the deadliest series of events in pre-modern history. But it represents something like 5 to 10% of the world's population at the time, not 72%. Still catastrophic, still historically significant, but a very different scale than the myth suggests. Moreover, these deaths occurred over many decades, under multiple Khans, Genghis himself, and then his sons and grandsons, Ogedai, Gayuk, Monk, and Kublai in the east, Batu and the Golden Horde in Russia, Hulagu in Persia, and across multiple campaigns in regions with very different conditions and responses. The destruction was not uniform or instantaneous, but rather a wave of conquest and consolidation that played out differently in different places. In some regions, the Mongols integrated relatively quickly into local systems of rule, adopting local customs and religions, becoming in effect indigenous dynasties. In others, particularly where resistance was fierce, the violence was extreme and prolonged. It's also important to note that not all death in this period was from direct killing. Medieval warfare, particularly siege warfare and the scorched earth tactics employed by all sides, not just the Mongols, led to famine, disease, and social breakdown that killed far more people than battle itself. When an army destroys crops and irrigation systems, When refugees flee into regions that cannot support them, when trade routes are disrupted and cities can no longer feed their populations, the resulting deaths are consequences of war but different in character from massacre. This distinction matters, not to minimize the suffering, but to understand the mechanisms and patterns of how these events unfolded. And there were, remarkably, moments and places where the Mongol conquests brought something other than pure destruction. The Mongol Empire, once established, enforced a remarkable degree of peace and stability across its vast territory. The Pax Mongolica, which lasted roughly from the mid-13th to the mid-14th century, saw the Silk Road reach its greatest extent and safety. Merchants could travel from Europe to China under the protection of a single set of laws and postal relay stations called yam that provided fresh horses and supplies. This led to an unprecedented exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas. Paper and printing technology spread westward from China. Persian and Islamic scholars brought astronomical and mathematical knowledge east. The Mongols themselves, though initially illiterate, became patrons of learning, sponsoring histories, supporting religious institutions of many faiths, and maintaining a policy of religious tolerance that was unusual for the age. The Mongol capital at Karakorum, and later the great cities of the Khanates like Sarai on the Volga, and Tabriz in Persia, and of course Beijing under Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty, became cosmopolitan centers where Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and practitioners of traditional Mongol shamanism could all be found, where travelers from distant lands met and exchanged stories and goods. The Venetian Marco Polo's journey to the court of Kublai Khan, whatever we make of the details and disputes about his account, represents a real phenomenon of connectivity that the Mongol Empire facilitated. In this sense, the Mongol legacy is profoundly complex. On one hand, immense destruction, suffering on a scale that changed the course of civilizations, cities that never recovered, a reputation for ruthlessness that still resonates today. On the other hand, the creation of the largest land empire in history, the facilitation of exchange and connection across Eurasia, the spread of technologies and ideas that might not otherwise have crossed cultural boundaries, and in some regions, a period of relative stability and prosperity once the initial conquests were complete. History rarely gives us simple moral lessons, and the Mongol story is a particularly vivid example of this ambiguity. Genghis Khan himself remains an enigmatic figure at the center of all this. The historical sources we have for his life are limited and filtered through various lenses. The secret history of the Mongols, the primary Mongol source, is part chronicle, part epic, written some years after his death and reflecting the political concerns of the generation that followed him. Persian and Chinese sources view him through the eyes of the conquered, sometimes with grudging admiration for his military genius, sometimes with horror at his ruthlessness, sometimes with both. What emerges is a portrait of a man of extraordinary ability and ambition, someone who rose from almost nothing to reshape the world, who created systems of governance and military organization that persisted long after his death, who was capable of both strategic brilliance and strategic brutality. He seems to have had a genuinely meritocratic vision for his followers, promoting based on ability rather than birth, which was radical in a society built on kinship. He codified laws in a system called the Yasa, which provided a common legal framework across the diverse peoples of his empire. He valued loyalty intensely, rewarding those who served him well and punishing betrayal without mercy. He understood the importance of intelligence and information, of knowing his enemies, of using psychological warfare as much as physical force. And he was willing to adapt, incorporating siege engineers from China and Persia, learning from each campaign, building an army that became more effective with each conquest. But he could also be utterly ruthless. Cities that killed his envoys, like Otrar, which murdered the members of a Mongol trade caravan and precipitated the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, were singled out for especially severe treatment, their rulers executed in gruesome fashion, their populations slaughtered, not simply as immediate revenge but as lessons to all who might follow. Genghis Khan understood that empires are built not just on force but on fear, on the reputation that makes future resistance seem futile. It is a cold calculation, one that saved Mongol lives and resources by making battles unnecessary, but one that required a willingness to commit atrocities that most people and most societies would find unacceptable. He died in 1227, probably during a campaign against the Western Xia Kingdom in what is now northwest China. The exact circumstances are unclear, as is the location of his burial. Mongol tradition held that the grave should be unmarked, that the great Khan should rest in peace without the possibility of desecration. Later sources claim that everyone who witnessed the funeral procession was killed to preserve the secret, that 1,000 horses were driven over the grave site to obliterate all trace. Whether or not these details are true, they speak to the way that mystery and legend began to gather around Genghis Khan even in death. His empire did not fragment immediately. His son Ogdi succeeded him and continued the conquests. Under Ogdi, the Mongols completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty, invaded Korea, pushed deeper into Russia and Eastern Europe, and laid the groundwork for the later conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China. Ogdi's death in 1241 probably saved Western Europe from a full-scale Mongol invasion, as the Mongol forces that had been devastating Poland and Hungary withdrew to participate in the selection of a new Khan. Later Khans would turn their attention in other directions, south into the Middle East, east into the completion of the Chinese conquest, and to the consolidation of the various khanates that divided Genghis's empire among his descendants. By the early 14th century, the unified Mongol Empire had effectively split into four main khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan's line, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppes. These khanates sometimes cooperated, sometimes fought each other, but all claimed descent from Genghis Khan and drew legitimacy from that connection. The Mongol dominance of much of Eurasia would last in various forms until the 14th and 15th centuries, when the rise of new powers, the Ming in China, Tamerlane's empire in Central Asia, the resurgent Russian principalities, and others, finally broke the Mongol hold. But even as political control fragmented and faded, the Mongol legacy persisted in less obvious ways. In Russia, the period of Mongol rule, the so-called Tatar yoke, shaped the development of the Russian state, influencing everything from military organization to tax collection to diplomatic protocol. In Persia, the Il Khans eventually converted to Islam and became patrons of Persian culture, but the administrative systems they established left lasting marks. In China, the Yuan dynasty fell after less than a century, but it had brought Tibet firmly into the Chinese sphere, established Beijing as the capital, and facilitated exchanges between Chinese and Islamic science and technology. And in the genetic legacy we mentioned earlier, in the Y chromosome lineage that stretches across Asia, we see a different kind of persistence, a biological echo of conquests and marriages and the way that political power has always translated into reproductive success. When you walk through the streets of cities from Istanbul to Beijing, some percentage of the people you pass carry in their genes a connection to that boy named Temujin, born in the endless grasslands 8.5 centuries ago. So what, then, are we to make of the myth that Genghis Khan killed 72% of humanity? Perhaps we can see it as a reflection of something true but distorted, like a face viewed through troubled water. The truth is that the Mongol conquests were devastating, that they caused death and suffering on a scale that marks them as one of the great catastrophes of pre-modern history, that entire regions were transformed, sometimes destroyed, by the passage of Mongol armies. The truth is also that human memory tends toward exaggeration, that trauma magnifies in the retelling, that a local apocalypse can feel like a global one to those who experience it, and that these feelings get encoded in chronicles and stories that shape how later generations understand events. The specific number, 72%, is almost certainly a modern invention, a misunderstanding or deliberate exaggeration that has spread in the age of the internet, where memorable claims circulate faster than careful corrections. It takes a grain of truth, the immense death toll and destruction of the Mongol conquests, and magnifies it beyond all historical plausibility, creating a myth that is more striking than the reality but less useful for understanding what actually happened. And in some ways, this myth does a disservice to history, because it makes the Mongols into cartoon villains, into supernatural forces of destruction, rather than human beings operating within a specific historical context with comprehensible motivations and methods. The real story of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire is more complex and more interesting than the myth. It is a story about the transformation of a fractious collection of nomadic tribes into the most effective military machine of the medieval world. It is about the collision of different ways of life, nomadic pastoralists with sedentary agricultural civilizations, and the violent but ultimately productive exchanges that resulted. It is about the way that connectivity and trade can flourish even under brutal conquest, about the ambiguous legacy of empire, about the way that what looks like the end of the world to one generation becomes the established order for the next. It is also a story that reminds us to be careful about the claims we encounter, to question the statistics and assertions that present themselves with apparent authority, to dig deeper and ask where information comes from, what evidence supports it, what contexts shape it. In an age where misinformation spreads rapidly, where striking claims can become widely accepted simply through repetition, the discipline of checking sources, of consulting actual historical scholarship rather than popular summaries, becomes ever more important. The Mongol conquests killed millions. That is not a small thing. It is not something to be dismissed or minimized. Those were real people, with lives and families and hopes, whose stories ended in fire and blood and chaos. The cities that fell, Samarkand and Merv and Baghdad and countless others, held centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture, libraries and schools and traditions that were lost or damaged beyond recovery. The suffering was immense and should not be forgotten or treated lightly in our pursuit of historical accuracy. But millions is not 72% of humanity. The difference matters, not because we are keeping score or trying to minimize the horror, but because understanding what actually happened, at what scale and in what contexts, is essential to understanding history itself. It helps us see the Mongols not as inexplicable demons but as humans acting within their historical moment, using strategies and tactics that made sense given their resources and objectives, causing devastation but also creating connections, destroying but also building, leaving a legacy that is genuinely mixed and complex. As you lie there in the darkness, perhaps you are wondering about the nature of historical truth, about how we can know anything at all about events so distant, so filtered through the biases and limitations of sources written by people with agendas, by people who were traumatized or propagandizing or simply mistaken. It is a good question, one that historians wrestle with constantly. We can never have perfect knowledge of the past. We are always working with fragments, with incomplete evidence, with texts that must be read critically and archaeological findings that must be interpreted carefully. But this does not mean that all claims are equally valid, that any interpretation is as good as any other. We build historical understanding through the careful accumulation of evidence from multiple sources, through cross-checking different kinds of data, through applying logic and skepticism to claims that seem implausible, through recognizing the patterns of how misinformation spreads and how myths develop. When demographic estimates from multiple scholars using different methodologies all point to world populations in the 13th century that make 72% casualties impossible, when the geographic reach of the Mongols clearly excludes vast swaths of humanity, when no scholarly source actually supports the specific claim, we can say with reasonable confidence that the claim is false. This is not the same as saying we know everything or that there is no uncertainty. There is tremendous uncertainty about many aspects of the Mongol conquests, about exact death tolls in specific cities, about the relative contributions of direct killing versus famine and disease, about how different regions and populations experienced and remembered these events. History is not a science that delivers certainty, but it is a discipline that can distinguish between well-supported conclusions and unsupported myths, between reasonable estimates and wild exaggerations. And perhaps, in the end, the persistence of the 72% myth tells us something important about our own time, about the way we engage with history in the age of social media and viral content. We are drawn to superlatives, to the biggest and worst and most extreme, because these capture attention in a crowded information landscape. A claim that Genghis Khan killed 72% of humanity is striking, memorable, shareable in a way that the more accurate but less dramatic statement that he caused somewhere between 30 and 40 million deaths is not. The myth has the structure of a modern clickbait headline, designed to provoke shock and engagement rather than understanding. But history is not entertainment, or at least, it is not only entertainment. It is also memory, evidence, inquiry, the patient work of trying to understand what happened and why and what it meant to the people who lived through it and what it means to us now. And when we replace that patient work with striking but false claims, we lose something important. We lose the texture and complexity of real human experience, the ability to see ourselves in the people of the past, to recognize that they were not so different from us, that they faced choices and constraints and possibilities that we can understand even if we would not make the same decisions. Genghis Khan was not a supernatural force. He was a man, born into a specific time and place, shaped by specific experiences, who made choices that had enormous consequences. The Mongols were not unstoppable demons but highly skilled and organized warriors who took advantage of the weaknesses and divisions of their enemies, who adapted and learned, who sometimes won and sometimes lost, though they won far more often than they lost. The people they conquered were not passive victims but actors in their own right, some resisting, some collaborating, some finding ways to survive and even thrive under new rulers, some preserving their cultures and identities through centuries of foreign domination. These human stories, messy and complicated as they are what history offers us. They teach us about the range of human possibility, about what people are capable of for both good and ill, about the contingency of events, the way that small choices can cascade into world-changing consequences, the way that systems and structures shape individual actions even as individuals shape those systems. When we reduce these stories to simple myths, to cartoonish villains and victims, we lose access to these lessons, to the genuine insights that history can provide. Let us drift now, gently, through some of these human stories, letting the grand sweep of conquest resolve into individual moments, individual lives caught up in events beyond their control or comprehension. Imagine a merchant in Samarkand in the year 1220, a man who has spent his life trading in silk and spices, who knows the caravan routes as well as he knows the streets of his own city. He has heard rumors of a new power rising in the east, these Mongols who have unified the tribes and destroyed the Karakhitai kingdom, but Samarkand is strong, wealthy, protected by walls and by the armies of the Khwarezmian Shah. He does not imagine that within a year, his world will be turned upside down. When the Mongols arrive after the Shah's governor foolishly murders their envoys, the merchant watches from his roof as the siege engines are assembled, as the walls that have stood for centuries are breached. He hears the screams as the city falls, sees the smoke rising from burning buildings. Perhaps he survives, emerging from hiding to find his city transformed, stripped of its wealth, many of his neighbors dead or enslaved. Perhaps he does not survive. Either way, his story is one of thousands, tens of thousands, each one as real and as full as any life today, each one ended or altered by forces that seem to come from nowhere, to sweep everything before them. Or consider a Mongol warrior, a man who was born to a miner family in one of the tribes that Genghis Khan unified. Before the unification, his life would have been bounded by the horizon of the steppe, by the seasonal movements of herds, by the endless small-scale raids and feuds between clans. But under Genghis Khan, he becomes part of something larger, travels farther than any of his ancestors, sees cities of stone and brick that dwarf anything in his imagination, crosses deserts and mountains, fights in battles where tens of thousands clash, accumulates wealth and status that would have been impossible in the old tribal system. Does he think about the people he kills? Does he distinguish between the warriors he faces in battle and the civilians caught in the sack of a city? Or does he simply accept that this is how the world works, that the strong take from the weak, that resistance means death and submission means life, at least the possibility of life. We cannot know what he thinks or feels, but we can recognize that he is not simply a mindless instrument of destruction but a person making choices, even if those choices are constrained by the military system he is part of, by the expectations of his commanders and comrades, by the material incentives that reward conquest and plunder. Or think of a Persian bureaucrat, a man trained in the arts of administration and governance, who finds himself employed by the Mongol conquerors after the fall of the Khwarezmian Empire. He is appalled by the destruction, mourns the loss of life and culture, yet he also recognizes that the Mongols need administrators, need people who know how to collect taxes, how to maintain irrigation systems, how to keep records. He makes the pragmatic decision to serve the new rulers, and in doing so, he helps to rebuild, to stabilize, to create a new order that, while foreign and sometimes brutal, is at least an order, a structure that allows life to continue, trade to resume, fields to be planted and harvested. Is he a collaborator, a traitor to his people? Or is he a survivor, someone doing what he must to preserve what can be preserved? History is full of such ambiguous figures, people navigating impossible situations, making choices that are neither heroic nor villainous but simply human, simply attempts to survive and perhaps to protect some small sphere of what they value. The Mongol conquests create millions of such moments, such choices, and the accumulated weight of these individual decisions shapes how the empire actually functions, how it evolves from a pure military conquest into a system of governance that, while never losing its capacity for violence, also develops structures of law, trade, and administration. In Russia, the Mongol impact takes a different form. The Rus principalities, divided and feuding among themselves, are no match for the Mongol armies that arrive under Batag Khan in the 1230s. Cities like Ryazan and Vladimir and Kozylsk are taken and destroyed. Kiev itself, the mother of Russian cities, falls in 1240, its churches plundered, its population scattered. But the Mongols, having demonstrated their power, do not attempt to directly occupy and administer Russia in the way they do with China or Persia. Instead, they establish a system of indirect rule, demanding tribute and obedience but leaving the Russian princes largely in place to govern their own territories. This creates a strange situation where Russian principalities become vassals of the Golden Horde, traveling to the Mongol capital to receive patents of authority, competing with each other for Mongol favor, incorporating Mongol practices and personnel into their own courts and armies. The period of Mongol overlordship, which lasts for more than 2 centuries, has profound effects on Russian development. Some historians argue that it retards cultural and economic development, cutting Russia off from Western European trends, fostering authoritarian patterns of rule. Others argue that the Mongol period actually strengthens the Russian state, providing models of centralized authority and military organization that later Russian rulers like Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great will build upon. The reality, as usual, is probably mixed. The Mongol overlordship is both destructive and constructive, both isolating and connecting. It brings devastation but also stability once established. It introduces new practices and ideas even as it disrupts old patterns. And it leaves in the Russian imagination a deep ambivalence, a sense that the Mongols, or Tatars as they are called in Russian sources, represent both a profound trauma and a formative part of Russian identity. This ambivalence persists even today, visible in debates about how to remember this period, whether to emphasize the suffering and resistance or to acknowledge the complex integration that actually occurred. In China, the Mongol conquest unfolds over more than half a century and in distinct phases. The initial assaults on the Jin dynasty in northern China begin under Genghis Khan himself and continue under his successors. The Jin, ethnically Jurchen but culturally Sinicized, put up fierce resistance, and the warfare is brutal and destructive. Cities change hands multiple times, populations are massacred or enslaved, and the agricultural heartland of northern China suffers terribly. But slowly, the Mongols adapt. They learn that China cannot be ruled from horseback, that they need to maintain the agricultural economy rather than destroying it, that Chinese administrative techniques and technologies are valuable. The conquest of the southern Song dynasty, which finally falls in 1279, is different in character. By this time, under Kublai Khan, the Mongols have become more sophisticated in their approach to China. The final campaigns are still military conquests, but Kublai is already thinking like a Chinese emperor, employing Chinese advisors, performing Chinese rituals, establishing a new dynasty called the Yuan. The Mongol elite remain distinct, retaining their language and customs and privileges, but they also absorb and adopt Chinese culture, creating a hybrid system that is neither purely Mongol nor purely Chinese but something new. Kublai Khan's court at Khanbaliq, modern Beijing, becomes one of the most cosmopolitan places on earth. Marco Polo's account, whatever its historical problems, captures something real about this quality. There are Mongols and Chinese, of course, but also Persians, Central Asians, Tibetans, Koreans, even the occasional European. There are Buddhists and Muslims and Christians of various sects and practitioners of traditional Mongol and Chinese religions, all coexisting under Mongol rule. The Yuan dynasty sponsors great public works, rebuilds the Grand Canal connecting northern and southern China, supports scholarship and the arts, though often in ways that favor non-Chinese collaborators over the traditional Chinese scholarly elite. For the ordinary Chinese person, life under the Yuan is complicated. There are ethnic hierarchies, with Mongols at the top, then various Central Asian peoples, then Northern Chinese, then Southern Chinese at the bottom. There are restrictions on movement and occupation, requirements to pay tribute and provide labor, the ever-present threat of arbitrary violence from Mongol authorities. But there is also stability, after the chaos of conquest. There is trade, as the Mongol Empire's networks bring goods from across Eurasia to Chinese markets. There is even a certain creative flowering, particularly in drama and vernacular literature, perhaps because the traditional examination system is disrupted and scholars turn to new forms of expression. The Yuan dynasty does not last as long as most Chinese dynasties, falling in 1368 to a rebellion led by a former Buddhist monk and peasant named Zhu Yuanzhang, who will found the Ming dynasty. But even the Ming, determinately Chinese in their rhetoric and symbolism, inherit and maintain many Yuan institutions, from the capital at Beijing to administrative structures to the incorporation of inner Asian territories like Tibet into the Chinese sphere. The Mongol conquest leaves permanent marks on China, even as Chinese culture ultimately absorbs and transforms the conquerors, a pattern that had happened before and would happen again in Chinese history. In the Middle East, the Mongol story reaches perhaps its most dramatic and destructive phase with the campaigns of Hulagu Khan in the 1250s. Hulagu, a grandson of Genghis Khan, is sent by his brother Monk, the reigning Great Khan, to subdue the Islamic lands. His armies sweep through Persia, destroying the assassin strongholds in the mountains, a sect that had terrorized the region for generations. Then, in 1258, Hulagu turns toward Baghdad, the greatest city of the Islamic world, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, a dynasty that had ruled in name if not always in fact for 5 centuries. The Caliph al-Mustasim makes the catastrophic error of underestimating the Mongol threat, of assuming that the divine protection that surrounds the caliphate will preserve the city. When Hulagu demands submission, the caliph refuses. The Mongol siege that follows is brief but devastating. Baghdad falls in February of 1258, and what follows is one of the most traumatic events in Islamic history. The city is sacked, its libraries burned, the caliph himself executed, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses according to some accounts, so that his royal blood would not touch the ground. The number of dead in Baghdad's fall is uncertain, with medieval sources giving wildly varying estimates from tens of thousands to over 1 million. Modern historians suggest the truth is somewhere in between, still a massive massacre that effectively destroys Baghdad as a major center of power and learning. The Tigris and Euphrates are said to run black with ink from destroyed manuscripts and red with blood, a poetic image that captures the sense of apocalypse that surrounds this event. For the Islamic world, the fall of Baghdad and the end of the Abbasid Caliphate represent a rupture comparable to the fall of Rome in Christian Europe, the end of an era, a wound in the collective memory that has never fully healed. Yet even here, the story is more complex than simple destruction. Hulagu, married to an Nestorian Christian woman and advised by Christians and Buddhists, shows favor to these communities, sparing churches and monasteries even as mosques are destroyed. His campaigns in Syria bring him into conflict with the Mamluks of Egypt, a military slave dynasty that has seized power and that represents the last major independent Muslim power in the region. In 1260, at Ain Jalut in Palestine, the Mamluks defeat a Mongol army, the first major defeat the Mongols suffer in the Middle East. This battle, often overlooked in popular histories focused on the Mongol conquests, is actually crucial. It stops the Mongol advance, establishes a boundary between the Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia and the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria, and provides proof that the Mongols can be beaten. The psychological impact is enormous, breaking the aura of Mongol invincibility, stiffening resistance elsewhere. And in the decades that follow, the Ilkhanate gradually transforms, its rulers converting to Islam, adopting Persian culture and language, becoming in effect a Persian dynasty that happens to be of Mongol origin. This pattern of conquest followed by cultural absorption is one of the most interesting aspects of the Mongol story. The Mongols prove extraordinarily effective at destroying and conquering, but less effective at maintaining a distinct Mongol identity across their vast empire. In each region, over time, the conquerors become like the conquered, adopting local religions, languages, and customs, until within a few generations, the Mongol rulers are barely distinguishable from indigenous elites except in their genealogical claims. In Russia, Mongol nobles convert to Islam and blend with Turkic peoples. In Persia, they become Persian Muslims. In China, they remain more distinct, but even there, intermarriage and cultural exchange blur boundaries. This cultural flexibility, this willingness to adopt useful practices from conquered peoples, is actually one of the sources of Mongol success. Unlike some conquerors who try to impose their own culture and systems wholesale, the Mongols are pragmatic, taking what works from each civilization they encounter and incorporating it into their own toolkit. This creates an empire that, while politically unified under the descendants of Genghis Khan, is culturally diverse, a patchwork of different languages, religions, and customs held together by military power, by the postal system and trade routes, by a common elite identity as Mongols, even as that identity becomes increasingly hybrid and complex. As we drift here through these centuries, watching empires rise and fragment and transform, it's worth pausing to consider what we mean by words like empire, conquest, and civilization. These are not neutral descriptive terms but value-laden concepts that carry different meanings in different contexts. An empire is, in the most basic sense, a state that rules over multiple distinct peoples and territories, usually through a combination of force and administration. But empires have been among the most successful political forms in human history, not because they are morally superior but because they can mobilize resources and coordinate activities across large areas, creating stability and prosperity even if that stability is purchased through violence and coercion. The Mongol Empire is in many ways the archetypal empire, built through conquest, maintained through military power, but also creating real benefits in terms of trade, communication, and relative peace across huge swaths of territory once the initial conquests are complete. To call it simply good or bad is to miss the point. It is a historical phenomenon that had effects both destructive and constructive, that caused immense suffering and also facilitated exchange and connection, that destroyed old orders and created new ones, for better and worse and usually both at once. And the Mongols themselves, who are they? In the modern world, Mongolia is a sparsely populated country, sandwiched between Russia and China, known for its vast landscapes and nomadic traditions that persist in attenuated form. The people of Mongolia today claim Genghis Khan as a national hero, a founder figure, a source of pride in a history that saw their ancestors conquer half the world. But they are acutely aware that their descendants are also scattered across Eurasia, in Russia, in China, in Central Asia, wherever Mongol armies traveled and settled and intermarried. The genetic and cultural legacy is diffuse, not concentrated in a single place or people. In some ways, this diffusion is the ultimate testament to Mongol success. They did not simply conquer and rule as a separate caste forever. They integrated, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes not, into the societies they had conquered, leaving traces in genes, in languages, in customs, in political structures, in memories and stories. The world the Mongols shaped was not a Mongol world in any pure sense, but a mixed world, changed by their passage, carrying forward elements of their legacy in complex and often unrecognized ways. And what of Genghis Khan himself, the man at the center of all these vast historical forces? If he could somehow see the modern world, what would he make of it? Would he recognize his legacy in the borders drawn on maps, in the cultural patterns that persist, in the stories told about him? Would he care about the debates over how many people died, over whether his conquests were ultimately beneficial or destructive, over how he should be remembered? We cannot know, of course. He lived in a world so different from ours that cross-temporal understanding is inevitably limited. His values, his worldview, his sense of what mattered were shaped by the steppe, by a culture that valued martial prowess and loyalty and the ability to endure hardship, that saw conquest as natural and glorious, that measured success in horses and territory and descendants. To judge him by modern standards of human rights and proportionality in warfare is almost meaningless, not because moral judgment is impossible across time but because the categories and concerns are so different. Yet he was still human, shaped by his experiences, capable of affection and cruelty, of strategic brilliance and moments of what might have been doubt or regret, though our sources rarely show us those moments. The secret history of the Mongols, the closest thing we have to a Mongol perspective on his life, portrays him as a hero but also as a man, someone who struggles and fails and learns, who makes alliances and enemies, who loves his family and friends and punishes betrayal with terrible finality. It's a reminder that even figures who loom impossibly large in history were once simply people, living day to day, making choices based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes, not knowing how the story would end or how they would be remembered. And perhaps that is one of the most important lessons we can take from this long exploration of the Genghis Khan myth and the reality behind it. History is made by people who are neither demons nor saints but simply human, with all the capacity for both good and evil that humanity encompasses. The systems and structures and cultures they create can outlast them, can shape the lives of millions who come after, but at the base of it all are individual choices, individual moments, accumulated and compounded over time into the vast patterns we call history. The claim that Genghis Khan killed 72% of humanity is false, demonstrably and importantly false. But the reality, that he and his descendants caused somewhere between 30 and 40 million deaths in the process of building the largest land empire in history, is still staggering, still one of the most significant and consequential events in human history. The suffering was real. The destruction was real. The transformation of Eurasia was real. And the legacy, mixed and complex and still debated, is real. What we do with that legacy, how we remember and interpret these events, matters. Not because it changes the past, which is fixed and unchangeable, but because it shapes how we understand the present and imagine the future. When we believe that a single person killed 72% of humanity, we are believing in a kind of historical determinism, in the power of individual evil to overwhelm everything else, in a vision of history as the story of great men, whether heroes or villains, whose actions alone determine the fate of millions. This is seductive but ultimately misleading. The real history is more distributed, more complex. Yes, individuals matter, and Genghis Khan clearly mattered immensely, but so do systems, cultures, technologies, environmental conditions, the choices of millions of ordinary people, the contingencies and accidents that no one controls. The Mongol conquests were not inevitable, not the product of a single evil genius, but the result of specific conditions, military innovations, political fragmentation among their enemies, and yes, the extraordinary abilities of Genghis Khan and his successors, all coming together in a particular historical moment. Understanding this complexity does not make history less interesting or less meaningful. It makes it more interesting, more relevant, more useful for understanding our own world, which is equally complex, equally the product of multiple overlapping causes and choices and accidents. When we replace complex reality with simple myths, we lose this understanding, lose the ability to learn from history in any meaningful way. As the night deepens around you, as this long journey through the Mongolian steppes and the cities they conquered comes toward its end, perhaps you are feeling the weight of history, the vertigo that comes from contemplating vast stretches of time and the countless lives that have unfolded and ended across those centuries. It is humbling, in the best sense, to recognize how small our own moment is in the grand sweep of human experience, how much has happened before we arrived and how much will happen after we are gone. But it is also empowering, in a way, to recognize that we are part of that continuity, that the choices we make, individually and collectively, add to the great river of history, shaping the world that future generations will inherit and remember. The people of the 13th century did not know they were living through what we would call the Mongol conquests, did not know how the story would end or how they would be remembered. They simply lived, made choices, tried to survive, sometimes resisted and sometimes accommodated, sometimes flourished and sometimes suffered, in the immediate press of their own present moment. We are the same. We live in our own present, making choices whose long-term consequences we cannot fully know or control, responding to forces larger than ourselves, trying to create meaning and connection and some measure of justice and beauty in a world that often seems overwhelming. And someday, if our civilization endures, future people will look back on our time the way we look back on the 13th century, trying to understand what happened and why, constructing narratives that capture some truth but also simplify and distort, debating what it all meant and what lessons it holds. What would we want those future people to know about us? Not myths and exaggerations, surely, but something approaching truth, something that honors the complexity of our experience, that recognizes both our failings and our achievements, that sees us as human. This is what we owe to the people of the past, to see them clearly, to resist the easy myths and the striking falsehoods, to do the patient work of understanding what really happened, as best we can with the evidence available. The Mongol conquests were devastating, but they were not the apocalypse. Genghis Khan was a remarkable and in many ways terrible figure, but he was not a supernatural force. The world that emerged from those conquests was shaped by them but not determined by them, was the product of countless choices and chances and conditions, only some of which had anything to do with the Mongols themselves. This more modest, more complex understanding is what history offers us, if we are willing to accept it instead of the simpler, more dramatic myths. And in accepting this complexity, we gain something valuable. We gain a sense of proportion, an understanding that even the most catastrophic events are survivable, that civilizations can recover, that human resilience and creativity persist even in the face of tremendous destruction. We gain a recognition that historical change is not simply imposed from above by great leaders or catastrophic events, but is also made from below by ordinary people adapting, resisting, rebuilding, finding ways to continue. We gain a humility about how much we know and how much remains uncertain, a skepticism toward claims that seem too neat or too extreme. These are not grand lessons, not the stuff of inspirational quotes or viral content, but they are real and useful, the kind of wisdom that comes from genuine engagement with history rather than consumption of historical entertainment. And they apply not just to the distant past but to our own time, to the claims we encounter about current events, to the statistics and assertions that present themselves with unearned authority, to the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and how we got here. In this sense, The myth of Genghis Khan killing 72% of humanity is a useful case study, a reminder to question, to check sources, to distinguish between what sounds dramatic and what is actually supported by evidence. It is a reminder that history is not simply data to be consumed but a discipline to be practiced, requiring patience and skill and a willingness to accept uncertainty and complexity. The true story of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire is dramatic enough without exaggeration. The rise from poverty and tribal obscurity to world domination in a single generation, the creation of a military system that could defeat any contemporary opponent, the conquest of territory stretching from Korea to Poland, the facilitation of exchange and communication across Eurasia, the impact on everything from genetics to language to political structures. All of this is extraordinary and real and consequential. We do not need to inflate the numbers to make it compelling. The reality is compelling enough, if we take the time to understand it properly. And as you lie here in the darkness, breathing slowly, feeling the day's tensions release their grip, perhaps you can carry with you not just facts and figures about the Mongol conquests, but a sense of connection to those distant lives, to the merchant in Samarkand and the warrior from the steppe and the bureaucrat in Baghdad, to all the people who lived through those times and whose experiences, aggregated and accumulated, make up what we call history. They were not statistics or abstractions but individuals, as real as you are, as complex and confused and hopeful and frightened as any of us. Their world is gone now, as completely as if it had never existed, survived only in fragments of text and pottery, in ruins of walls and cities, in genetic markers and lone words and half-remembered stories. But in remembering them, even imperfectly, even through the distorting lens of centuries, we keep something alive, we maintain a connection to the vast human story of which we are all part. And in learning to remember them accurately, to distinguish truth from myth, we honor them and ourselves, we practice the discipline of careful thought that is perhaps our best defense against the easy lies and comforting falsehoods that every age produces. The Mongol horsemen are gone now, their empire fragmented and absorbed, their descendants scattered and transformed. But the questions they raise, about the nature of power and conquest, about the costs and benefits of empire, about how we remember and understand historical trauma, about the difference between myth and reality, these questions remain with us, as relevant and urgent as ever. And in grappling with these questions, in refusing easy answers and simple narratives, we participate in the ongoing human project of making sense of our experience, of finding meaning in the chaos of events, of building understanding across the chasms of time and culture that separate us from those who came before. So sleep now, if sleep is what you seek, with the knowledge that you have walked for a time through the vanished world of the 13th century, have seen something of what the Mongol conquests were and were not, have understood that the myth of 72% is just that, a myth, powerful but false, and that the truth, while less sensational, is more interesting and more useful. Sleep with the awareness that history is not a collection of facts to memorize but a living conversation between past and present, between what happened and what we make of it, between the dead and the living who remember them. And when you wake, perhaps you will carry with you a small piece of wisdom from this journey, a recognition that striking claims deserve scrutiny, that complex realities resist simple summaries, that the patient work of understanding is worth doing even when, especially when, the myths are more exciting than the truth. You will know that Genghis Khan, whatever else he was not responsible for killing 72% of humanity, that his impact, while enormous and in many ways terrible, was also bounded and specific, that the world survived his conquests and was changed by them but not destroyed. This is a small thing, perhaps, one corrected myth among thousands that circulate in our information-saturated age. But small things matter. Each piece of understanding, each moment of clarity, each correction of error adds up over time, shapes how we think and what we believe and how we act. And in an age where misinformation spreads with viral speed, where attention is fragmented and depth is sacrificed for breadth, the simple discipline of checking facts, of demanding evidence, of accepting complexity, becomes a form of resistance, a way of maintaining intellectual integrity in the face of constant noise. The Mongols conquered much of the known world, but they did not conquer truth, did not make reality subject to their will, did not kill 72% of humanity no matter how many times the claim is repeated. Truth persists, patient and stubborn, waiting for those who will do the work of uncovering it. And in that persistence lies hope, the hope that we can still distinguish real from false, that evidence still matters, that history can still teach us if we are willing to listen carefully, to look beyond the myths, to see the past as it was rather than as we imagine it or as stories have distorted it. As this journey ends, as the voice that has accompanied you through these hours of darkness begins to fade, know that you are connected now to a story that spans centuries and continents, to a moment in human history when the world was remade through conquest and connection, through destruction and creation, through the actions of countless individuals whose names we will never know and a few whose names have echoed through the ages. You are part of that same human story, living your own moment, making your own choices, participating in your own time in the great ongoing experiment of human civilization. The Mongols rode out from their grasslands and shook the world. The world survived, changed but continuous, and here we are, centuries later, still trying to understand what happened and what it means. That effort to understand, that refusal to accept easy myths, that commitment to truth even when it is complex and uncertain, that is our tribute to those who came before, our responsibility to those who will come after, our best hope for navigating our own turbulent time. So rest now, gentle listener, in the peace of this quiet night. The past is past, the dead are dead, but memory lives on, and understanding matters, and the truth, complex and patient as it is, waits for those who seek it. The Mongols conquered empires, but we conquer ignorance, one careful thought at a time, one corrected myth at a time, one moment of genuine understanding at a time. And in that work, humble as it may seem, lies something worth doing, something that connects us across the centuries to all who have sought truth in the face of myth, clarity in the face of confusion, understanding in the face of the vast and often incomprehensible sweep of human history. Sleep well, and wake refreshed, carrying with you the knowledge that history, properly understood, is neither a source of nightmares nor a collection of inspiring fables, but something richer and more subtle, a mirror in which we can see ourselves reflected across time, a conversation between past and present that helps us understand where we have been and perhaps, if we are wise and careful and honest, where we might be going. The journey through the Mongol past is complete for now. The journey through your own present continues. May you walk it with eyes open, with mind questioning, with heart engaged, seeking always the truth beneath the myths, the reality beneath the stories, the human beneath the legend. Good night, traveler. Thank you for walking this path with me through the mists of 8 centuries and the ruins of empires. Until we meet again in some other chapter of the great human story, rest well, dream peacefully, and remember that even the greatest conquerors could not kill truth, could not destroy the human capacity for understanding, could not prevent future generations from seeing clearly, if they choose to look. The story of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire is vast and complex and tragic and remarkable. But it is knowable, at least in part, if we bring to it patience and care and a commitment to evidence over sensation. And in that knowing lies a kind of victory, small but real, over the darkness and confusion that always threaten to overwhelm our understanding of the past and present alike. Rest now. The horses have fallen silent. The cities are rebuilt or forgotten. The steppes stretch empty under the stars as they have for millennia, as they will for millennia more, indifferent to the brief passage of human ambition and suffering and glory. But we remember, imperfectly but sincerely, and in that remembering, we honor the past and serve the future. Good night.